Betty sat at the kitchen table longer than usual that morning, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. The house was quiet in that way only familiar places get when something is wrong. Not peaceful, just heavy. She stared at the wall across from her, at the faded calendar that still had last month circled in red, and finally spoke. "I don't know how else to say it," she said softly. "Everything we thought was happening, it ain't happening no more." The words landed heavier than she expected. For weeks, maybe months, there had been a plan. Not a perfect plan, not an easy one, but something to hold on to. Phone calls had been made. Promises hinted at. People told her to stay patient, to stay hopeful, to trust that things were moving behind the scenes. Betty had done exactly that. She waited. She prayed. She kept the house ready. And now, just like that, the direction had changed. "I was told one thing," she continued, "and now they're telling me another." Brian listened quietly from across the table. He didn't interrupt. He learned that sometimes Betty needed to get the words out without being steered. When she paused, he asked gently, "What changed?" She shook her head slowly. "They say it's not the right time anymore, that it's better if we wait." "But wait for what?" "I've been waiting my whole life." Her voice cracked at the end, and she pressed her lips together, refusing to cry. Betty had never been someone who liked breaking down in front of others. Strength had been her armor for decades. But this felt different. This felt like something slipping through her fingers that she might never get back. For a long time, the plan had been simple in her mind. There would be steps. There would be visits. There would be progress. She had cleaned, fixed, organized, complied. She had followed every instruction she was given, even when it didn't make sense. And every time she asked where things stood, the answer was always the same, just a little more time. "I found out yesterday," Betty said. Not from a letter, not from someone official, just a phone call. Real short, real cold. She looked up then, her eyes sharp with hurt. "They already decided. They just didn't tell me until now." Brian leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "So what are they saying now?" "That the plan's changed," she replied. "That what we were working toward isn't on the table anymore." The room fell silent again. Outside, a car passed on the road, tires crunching against gravel, the sound fading as quickly as it came. Life moving on, indifferent. Betty rubbed her hands together nervously. "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong. Missed something. Said the wrong thing." "You didn't," Brian said firmly. "You did exactly what they asked." She nodded, but it was clear the reassurance didn't fully sink in. When you spend your life being told you're the problem, it's hard not to believe it. Later that afternoon, Betty finally said the part she'd been holding back. "They told me not to expect what I was expecting," she said. "That it's better if things stay the way they are for now." "For now," Brian repeated. She let out a bitter laugh. "That's what they always say." The update spread quickly once Brian shared that something had shifted. Messages poured in from people confused, angry, heartbroken. Everyone wanted to know what changed, who changed it, and why. But the truth was messier than a simple answer. That night, Betty sat alone on the porch, wrapped in an old sweater, watching the hills fade into darkness. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "I let myself believe it this time," she said. "That was my mistake." Brian stood nearby, leaning against the railing. Believing wasn't a mistake. She looked at him. "Feels like it." For Betty, hope had always been dangerous. Every time she allowed it in, something came along to take it back. But this time hurt more because it wasn't just about disappointment. It was about trust. "I told people things were moving forward," she said. "I told them we were getting somewhere. Now I feel stupid." "You're not stupid," Brian replied. "You were honest about what you were told." She shook her head. "Doesn't matter. I still look like a liar." Inside the house, the table was still set the way it always was. Old habits die hard. Plates placed as if everyone might walk through the door at any moment. Betty noticed Brian looking at it. "I keep doing that," she said. setting it up like things are normal. Because to you, they are, he answered. She sighed. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending. As the evening wore on, Betty finally admitted the truth she hadn't said out loud yet. They didn't just delay it, she said. They're talking about changing the whole direction. Different arrangements. Different expectations. Brian frowned. Did they explain why? No, she said simply. They never do. That was the part that hurt the most. Not just the decision, but the lack of explanation. The sense that her life, her family, her future were being rearranged by people who didn't have to live with the consequences. Before Brian left that night, Betty stopped him at the door. Promise me something, she said. What? Don't let them tell the story without me. He nodded. I won't. After he left, Betty sat down at the table again and picked up her phone. She stared at the screen, scrolling through messages she hadn't answered yet. People asking for updates. People offering support. People confused by rumors already spreading. She typed slowly, carefully, then erased it all. I don't even know what to say anymore, she whispered. Because the truth was this. Plans hadn't just changed. The ground beneath her feet had shifted again, and once more, she was being told to stand still and accept it. And for the first time in a long time, Betty wasn't sure she could. What do you think really caused the plans to change so suddenly? And should Betty have been told sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The next morning came too quickly. Betty barely slept, her mind replaying the same questions over and over, each one heavier than the last. When daylight finally crept through the thin curtains, it didn't bring clarity. It only made everything feel more real. She moved through the house slowly, as if each step needed permission. The coffee pot clicked on out of habit, though she barely drank any. Her phone sat on the counter, face down, silent. No calls, no updates, just the same unanswered weight hanging in the air. They tell you to wait, she muttered to herself, but they don't tell you what you're waiting for. By mid-morning, Brian returned. He could tell right away that something had shifted overnight. Betty wasn't angry anymore. That scared him more than tears would have. You okay? He asked gently. She shrugged. I'm tired in a way sleep don't fix. They sat across from each other again, the same table, the same chairs, but the energy was different. Yesterday had been shock. Today was reality setting in. I keep thinking about all the things they said before Betty began, how they told me I was doing good, how they said progress was being made. Brian nodded. They did say that. Well, now it feels like none of that mattered, she replied. Like it was just something to keep me calm. She looked down at her hands. You know what hurts the most? What? They didn't even ask me how I felt about the change. That was the part people outside the situation didn't always understand. It wasn't just about decisions being made. It was about being erased from the process entirely. They talk about my life like it's paperwork, Betty continued. Like I'm not the one living it. Online, the reaction was already growing louder. Speculation ran wild. Some people insisted the change meant something bad had happened behind the scenes. Others claimed it was always going to end this way. A few accused Betty of exaggerating or misunderstanding. Brian showed her some of the comments, then quickly stopped. I shouldn't have done that, he said. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No, I need to see it, even the ugly parts. One comment stuck with her more than the others. Maybe this is for the best. She stared at the words for a long time. For who? She asked quietly. That afternoon, Betty finally got another call. It was short, polite, careful. They said plans are being reevaluated, she explained after hanging up. That things evolved. That there are concerns. What kind of concerns? Brian asked. They didn't say, she replied. Just said it's complicated. Complicated. That word had followed her for years. Every time something went wrong, every time something was taken away, it was always complicated. I asked them straight out, Betty said. I said, did I do something wrong? Brian waited. They said no, she continued. But it didn't sound like no. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. If I didn't do nothing wrong, then why am I the one paying for it? As the day went on, more pieces started to surface. Brian began hearing from people he hadn't heard from in months. Some claimed they'd been told different versions of the situation. Others admitted they'd assumed things were settled when they weren't. There's a lot of confusion, Brian told her, even among the people who are supposed to know what's going on. Betty let out a dry laugh. Ain't that something? Confusion was one thing. Silence was another. They could have told me sooner, she said. That's what hurts, letting me believe something that wasn't true. She walked over to the window and looked out at the yard. The grass needed cutting. The porch railing needed fixing. Little things she'd been putting off because she thought bigger changes were coming. I was saving my energy, she said. Now I feel foolish for it. Brian stood beside her. You were preparing for hope. She shook her head. Hope don't prepare you for disappointment. That evening, Betty finally spoke about something she hadn't told anyone yet. They said I might need to adjust my expectations, she said quietly. Brian frowned. What does that mean? She swallowed hard. It means I need to stop expecting things to move forward. The words felt final, even if no one had officially said them yet. Later that night, Brian went live again. This time, his tone was careful. He didn't speculate. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth as he knew it. Plans changed, he said. Betty wasn't given much explanation. And she's hurting. The comments flooded in immediately. Support, anger, disbelief. Some demanded accountability. Others begged him to stop covering the story altogether, saying it was too painful to watch. Betty watched the replay later, alone. He didn't lie, she said softly. That's all I ever wanted, for someone to just tell the truth. But even truth couldn't fix what was broken. The next few days blurred together. No more calls came. No clarifications. Just waiting again. Betty started cleaning obsessively, scrubbing already clean counters, folding towels that didn't need folding, keeping her hands busy so her mind wouldn't wander. I feel like if I stop moving, she admitted one evening, everything will catch up to me. Brian sat quietly, letting her talk. They changed the plan, she continued, but they didn't change the pain. That stayed right where it was. At one point, she asked the question she'd been avoiding. Do you think this is it? She asked. Do you think this is as far as it goes? Brian hesitated. I don't know. She nodded. I appreciate you not lying. That night, Betty wrote something in a notebook she kept hidden in a drawer. She didn't show it to anyone. It wasn't for the internet. It wasn't for officials. It was just for her. I did everything they asked. I waited. I believed. And now I don't know what comes next. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty. It was the feeling that her voice no longer mattered. They make plans about me, she said the next morning, but they don't make them with me. And that, more than anything, was what finally broke her resolve. Because when plans change without warning, without explanation, without consent, it stops feeling like help. It starts feeling like control. And Betty was running out of strength to accept that quietly. The silence stretched longer than Betty expected. Days passed without calls, without letters, without even vague reassurances. It wasn't just the absence of answers that hurt anymore. It was the growing realization that decisions were being made somewhere far away by people who would never sit at her table or see the way her hand shook when the phone rang. She stopped checking the phone as often. At first, it rang only in her head. Then even that quieted. They always tell you to wait, Betty said one afternoon, her voice low, almost distant. But nobody tells you how long you're allowed to hurt while you're waiting. Brian noticed a change in her. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't asking the same questions. Instead, she moved through the days with a hollow steadiness that worried him more than panic ever could. You still eating? He asked. She nodded. Enough. It was an answer that said very little. Online, the tone had shifted. Where there had once been outrage and urgency, now there was division. Some people still defended Betty fiercely. Others questioned her version of events. A few began suggesting that the sudden change in plans meant there was more to the story than anyone knew. "That's what they always say," Betty muttered when Brian read her one of the comments. "There must be something she ain't telling." She looked up at him. "If there was something wrong with me, don't you think they'd tell me?" Brian didn't have an answer. Rumors multiplied. Someone claimed a report had been filed. Another said a meeting had gone badly. A third insisted the change was temporary and being misinterpreted. Each theory spread faster than the last. None of them confirmed, all of them harmful. Betty stopped listening. "I can't fight ghosts," she said. "I don't even know what's real anymore." One evening, she finally admitted something she'd been holding back. "They asked me questions last time," she said quietly. "Questions that didn't feel like help." Brian leaned forward. "What kind of questions?" She hesitated. "About my past. About things that happened years ago. Stuff I already explained before." That was when it clicked for him. Plans didn't just change overnight without reason. Someone had reopened something. Somewhere, a file had been pulled back out. It felt like they were looking for a reason, Betty continued. Not to move forward, to stop. Her hands tightened in her lap. When people start digging, they don't do it to help you. They do it to protect themselves. The next morning, a letter arrived. Official, plain, carefully worded. Betty read it once, then again. "They're extending the review," she said flatly. "No timeline, no guarantees." Brian exhaled slowly. "Did they explain why?" She shook her head. "Just said new information came to light." New information. That could mean anything, she whispered. The letter didn't accuse her of wrongdoing. It didn't clear her either. It simply suspended everything in limbo, a bureaucratic pause that felt endless. "They don't have to say no," Betty said later. "All they got to do is keep saying not yet." As word of the letter spread, the online response exploded again. Some people blamed the system. Others blamed Betty. A few blamed the creators who had covered the story in the first place. Brian took the heat publicly. Accusations flew that he was exploiting the situation, that he was stirring emotions for views, that he was hiding information. "I'm not the one making decisions," he said in a video. "I'm just telling you what's happening." But even he could feel the tide turning. Betty watched the backlash quietly. "They're getting tired," she said. "People don't like stories that don't end." She paused, especially when the ending ain't happy. That night, Betty couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet, staring at the same spot on the wall where a picture used to hang. She'd taken down weeks ago, thinking it might be replaced by something new. Now the nail remained, bare and useless. "I planned my life around something that didn't happen," she whispered. In the days that followed, she began pulling back. She stopped agreeing to updates, stopped answering questions, stopped correcting false rumors. "What's the point?" she asked Brian. They already decided what they want to believe. He respected her choice, but it worried him. Silence, in situations like this, often allowed the loudest voices to shape the narrative. Sure enough, others stepped in to fill the gap. Videos appeared claiming inside knowledge. Posts surfaced alleging secret meetings. Some insisted Betty had changed her mind herself. Others suggested she had been advised to stay quiet. None of it was true. "They talk about me like I'm a headline," Betty said bitterly. "Not a person." One afternoon, she finally broke down, not in tears but in anger. "I did what they asked," she said, her voice shaking. "I cleaned. I waited. I trusted. I kept my mouth shut when people lied about me. And still, it wasn't enough." Brian listened, letting her say it all. "They changed the plan," she continued, "but they never changed the standard. It keeps moving, and I'm always behind it." That was the moment she admitted something that shocked him. I don't know if I can do this again, she said. Do what? Hope, she replied. The word hung between them, heavy and fragile. Later that week, Brian received a message from someone claiming to be close to the situation. The tone was cautious, almost warning. This isn't over, but it's not moving the way you think. He didn't share it publicly. He didn't even show Betty. Not yet. Because the truth was, no one seemed to know what direction things were moving in anymore. Betty felt it too. They're not pushing forward, she said one morning. They're waiting for me to give up. Brian frowned. Why would you think that? She met his eyes. Because it's easier if I walk away on my own. The realization hurt more than any letter ever could. They don't have to deny me anything if I stop asking, she said. They can just say, I chose peace. Her voice cracked. But it won't be peace. It'll be surrender. That afternoon, she packed a small box of things she'd been saving. Not to leave, just to feel prepared. I hate feeling unready, she said. As days turned into another week, the weight of it all settled deeper. Betty smiled less, spoke less, laughed almost not at all. Yet somehow, through it all, she remained kind. She still thanked people, still asked about others, still apologized for being tired. That's what breaks my heart, Brian told someone later. She keeps thinking she owes the world something. One night, she finally said what had been building inside her for days. They changed the plans, she said quietly. But they changed me too. Brian waited. I used to believe that if I did everything right, things would work out, she continued. Now I see that doing everything right doesn't protect you from being forgotten. She looked down at her hands. I don't know who I am in this story anymore. That question lingered long after the words faded. Because at the center of all the noise, all the speculation, all the shifting plans, was a woman who had followed every rule she was given, and still found herself standing alone, waiting for an ending that refused to arrive. By the time the third week arrived, Betty no longer checked the calendar. Counting days had started to feel like counting losses, and she didn't have the strength for that anymore. Time moved differently now, slower in the mornings, heavier at night. Each day felt like a repetition of the one before it, except something inside her kept quietly shifting. Waiting had changed her. At first, waiting felt hopeful, like standing at a bus stop knowing the ride would eventually come. Then it became tense, like standing in a storm without shelter. Now it felt hollow. Waiting without information wasn't patience anymore. It was endurance. They don't even have to tell me no, Betty said one evening, staring out the window. They just let me sit here until hope wears itself out. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. That clock had always been there, but lately it sounded louder, as if each second wanted to be noticed. Brian noticed the change before Betty said anything. She spoke less. She smiled less. She moved through the house with the carefulness of someone trying not to disturb something fragile inside themselves. When he asked how she was doing, she didn't say fine anymore. I'm tired, she said. Not sleepy tired. Soul tired. She stopped setting extra plates on the table. That small habit had lingered long after the separation, as if muscle memory refused to accept reality. One night, she caught herself reaching for a fourth plate and froze. Her hand hovered in the air before she slowly put it back. I can't keep pretending, she whispered to herself. The phone rang one afternoon while she was folding laundry. She almost didn't answer. Every call now carried the weight of possibility, and she wasn't sure she could handle another letdown. But she answered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, professional. The kind of voice trained not to sound emotional, even when delivering emotional news. They thanked her for her continued cooperation, acknowledged her patience, used phrases that sounded polite but distant. Then came the words that changed everything. At this point, we're reevaluating the original plan. Betty closed her eyes. So, It changed, she said quietly. There was a pause. We're adjusting our direction to explore alternative long-term arrangements. Alternative, long-term arrangements. Each word felt heavier than the last. And nobody thought to tell me before now? She asked. We understand this is difficult, the voice replied. Our priority is safety and stability. When the call ended, Betty sat very still. No tears came first, just a tightness in her chest, like all the air had been pressed out of her lungs at once. Brian arrived later that day. One look at her face told him everything. They changed it, she said before he could ask. Not delayed, not slowed down. Changed. He sat down slowly. What does that mean for you? She shook her head. I don't even think they know yet. All I know is the ending I was holding on to, it's not the one they're choosing. That was the moment hope finally cracked. Not shattered. Cracked. Enough to let reality seep in. For weeks, Betty had believed that if she followed every rule, stayed patient, showed cooperation, things would move back toward what they were promised. She believed effort mattered. That endurance would be rewarded. But the truth was harder. Sometimes decisions are made far from the people they affect. Sometimes patience isn't a bridge. It's a holding pattern. I did everything they asked, she said, her voice steady but low. Everything. And it still wasn't enough. Online, the reaction was immediate once word spread. Anger exploded in comment sections. Accusations flew in every direction. Some blamed the system. Some blamed the people involved earlier. Others blamed Betty herself for not being more visible, more vocal, more demanding. Betty didn't read any of it. I've spent my whole life being looked at, she told Brian. I'm done being judged by people who don't know what it feels like to wait like this. She made a decision that shocked even those closest to her. She stepped back. No interviews. No statements. No responses to rumors. I don't owe anyone my pain, she said, and I can't heal if I keep reopening the wound for strangers. That silence didn't stop the noise. In fact, it made it louder. People questioned her absence, speculated, assumed the worst. Some claimed she'd given up. Others claimed she'd been silenced. The truth was simpler. She was protecting herself. One evening, Brian asked the question he'd been carrying for days. Do you still want me to tell what's happening? Betty thought for a long moment. I want the truth told, she said, but not as entertainment, not as a fight, just the truth. And what's the truth? He asked gently. She exhaled. That plan's changed. That nobody explained why. And that sometimes you can do everything right and still lose what you were promised. That truth didn't fit neatly into headlines. It wasn't dramatic enough for outrage culture. It didn't give people a villain they could point to with certainty. But it was real. The days that followed felt different. Still painful, but clearer. Betty stopped checking the phone every hour. She stopped sitting by the window waiting for cars that never came. She focused on what she could control. Her routines, her space, her sense of self. She started cooking again, not because she had to, but because it grounded her. She cleaned not out of anxiety, but out of care. She listened to music again, something she hadn't done in months, because silence felt easier than reminders. I forgot who I was before all this waiting, she admitted one afternoon. Brian smiled softly. You didn't lose her? No, Betty said. I just set her aside while I was hoping. There were still hard moments. Grief doesn't leave politely. It comes in waves, unexpected, unannounced. A memory, a sound, a familiar object. But alongside the grief came something else. Acceptance. Not the kind that feels peaceful or resolved. The kind that lets you stand up after being knocked down too many times. One night, Betty laughed at something small, a joke on the radio, barely funny. The sound startled her. She covered her mouth, then laughed again, quietly. I didn't think I still had that in me, she said. You do, Brian replied. You always did. As time passed, the story slowly faded from public attention. New topics replaced it. New outrage took its place.